Today's speaker is rather easy to introduce. I couldn't help but think when you were on the drum and we were listening to the heartbeat that today's speaker is the heartbeat of the fellowship of the Inner Light Church, Bruce Shelton. He is our senior pastor. He is the chair of our pastoral council. He is on the board of directors again. I know you've served as president, as treasurer. He's done so much with this church. And I wouldn't be doing it justice if I didn't mention who's seated next to him. Marty is also the heartbeat of this church. And we are so privileged to have Bruce speaking with us today and to have Marty here with us. Thank you, Bruce.
All right. Well, good morning, everybody. When I speak here at the fellowship, I always find it's my practice. I find it extremely helpful just to have a few moments of silence in which I ask for all of us to invoke the presence of God so that the right words, will come out that really you need to hear today, okay? So let's all just be quiet just for a moment. So it is in thy name we do pray. Amen. All right. Well, every 4th of July, I always tell myself, I'm going to give a 4th of July talk at the fellowship. And every year it passes by. So this year I said I'm going to do it. And what I really want us to do today is take a look at our country and why it is the way it is. We have so much to be thankful for. We take our freedoms for granted, and we're so prone as good Americans to find this is wrong about our government, that's wrong, this is wrong about our country, and on, right? But with the fact we have the freedom to do that is hugely important. Other countries, there are many countries in the world, you go to prison for criticizing your country. So today we're going to look at what's right about our country. We're going to take a few moments really to give some thanks for the fact that we have what we have. And I thought it was interesting yesterday when I went to the mailbox. I got Time magazine, and on the cover here it says 240 reasons to celebrate America. Isn't that cool? And it kind of goes along with my feelings, There's so much right. I really recommend you pick up that magazine if you haven't read it, because I was looking through it, and they just go through and point out all these wonderful things that are happening in our country right now, right? So, specifically today, what we're going to look at are some very important documents that were created. We're going to take a look at how they were created and what their meaning is. And those documents are the Declaration of Independence, our Constitution. We're going to take a particular look at the First Amendment to the Constitution, which provides us with freedom of religion. What could be more important than that? And then we're going to close by taking a look at the Great Seal and the symbology, especially the metaphysical, the spiritual symbology that we find in our Great Seal, which, by the way, has been both the front and the back sides of the Great Seal have been on the American dollar bill since 1935, thanks to the order of Franklin Roosevelt. So, also, I want to just point out that the fact that things happened the way they happened back, during the Revolution and right after the Revolution, was a result of this coming together of a group of individuals, all choosing to incarnate together at that point in time. And it was the magic, that happened between those individuals that coming together, these geniuses. The 6 of them that I appreciate the most are George Washington, of course, Ben Franklin, James Monroe, Alexander Hamilton, John Adams, and Thomas Jefferson. They're the 6. They're the standouts, but they weren't the only ones. It was only because of these men coming together and working together and providing the vital leadership that was necessary that not only did we win the revolution, but what was more important, we won the peace, in the years that followed by creating this Constitution. So, it's July 4th, 1776, 240 years ago tomorrow, right? 56 brave men signed a this document in which they basically knew when they signed this document that if the rebellion failed, they were signing their death warrant. They knew they'd all be hung or shot for treason, right? Can you imagine the courage it must have taken to basically declare war on the most powerful military force the world had ever known up to that point, the English Navy and Army? But they did it, you see. What courage that must have been. 56 guys, right? Now, I had never read the Declaration of Independence before. It's not long, but I did in preparing for this talk. About 90% of the Declaration of Independence is a list of complaints that the colonists had towards the King of England that basically justified their decision to break away from England, okay? So it's like a legal document. And of course, we all know that the writer, the person who drafted it, was Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is interesting. Something I learned in preparing for this talk is that he was not viewed as a strong orator because he had some type of a speech impediment. He might have had some anxiety thing or something. He got nervous. What I read wasn't clear about what the impediment was, but he was not known as a strong orator. But boy, could that guy write! And they all knew it. And he was a lawyer. He knew the language of the day. And that's why he was chosen. There was actually, 3 people on the committee, John Adams and Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, and the other 2 says, hey, you're the writer, you do it. So he wrote most of it, and then of course it was edited by that committee and then went to the Congress and was edited there as well. But most of it is Thomas Jefferson, and so we have a great deal to thank for him because the several paragraphs which we read today for the inspirational reading really dealt with the heart of what this new country was all about. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, this was a radical idea for that time. There was no one had ever come up with saying we're going to create an entire government based on these principles of equality. You see, this was amazing. Now, of course, we're quick to point out. He says all men are created equal. What about the women? Right? I know you women are hearing this, right? And good question, right? What about he was talking about the freedmen. He wasn't talking about the slaves, the men who were in slavery. Now, because this principle was laid out there at that point in time, as our collective consciousness evolved, you see, what happened was we corrected those problems, right? So in the 13th Amendment, which was ratified in December of 1865, right at the end of the Civil War, we had an amendment, abolished slavery. Right? 5 years later, in 1870, the 15th Amendment was ratified, and African Americans were given the right to vote. And then finally, we caught up with you women here, right? A little late on that. 1920, August 1920, 19th Amendment, right? Women given the right to vote. So the principle was there. That's the point, you see. This whole thing of equality. It took a while for us to get it right. But it was there, and this was a radical idea that we're all created equal. Now, this is based upon all the great spiritual teachers have always taught this. Jesus said that we're all the children of God. You see, the children of God. He didn't just say the men are the children of God or the Jews are the children of God. He says we're all created as the children of God. And so this principle finally is putting into place, you see, a spiritual principle that's actually true. And this principle then was used as a model, you see, for the creation of the Constitution. After the war was successfully won, it was used as a principle for and the Constitution was used as a model for governments throughout the world. Since that time, who were trying to create a government that was for the people and of the people. Okay, so this is wonderful. This Declaration of Independence. Now, the war was just starting. It had already been going on, of course. They had New York City had already had the battle up there before the Declaration of Independence on July 4th, 1776. But the war raged on for another 5 years, and finally in October of 1781, we had the big battle at Yorktown, right in our own backyard. And we won. Lord Cornwallis surrendered his entire British army. Now, Lord Cornwallis was one of the most aggressive and capable generals that the English had. And he lost his entire army to George Washington and to General Rochambeau of the French. And so the British says, okay, we've had enough. We've finally had enough. And so this is when the war was won. Now, it wasn't actually legally, it didn't end until 2 years later at the Treaty of Paris. But for practical purposes, the hostilities ended at the Battle of Yorktown, okay? But this is the key here. Most revolutions, as we all know, if the revolutionaries win, they either create a government that's no better than the government they created, just different faces, right? Or they create a government that's even far worse, right? We all know of this in history, right? So what's going to happen now? All these new Americans, right, looking around, what's going to happen? What are we going to do now? Well, at first, they created what's known as they created this constitution called the Articles of Confederation. The Articles of Confederation provided for a loose alliance between all the, they call them states now, not colonies, between these 13 states. Part of the reason it did not provide for a strong central or federal government, okay? And there was a reason for that. There was a real resistance on the part of many colonists and many of the political leaders when the country was when they were trying to first decide what we're going to do, what kind of government we're going to have. There's a real resistance to having a strong central government because everyone was afraid that if we create a strong central government, we might just replace one king for another. What's to keep a group of people or a king from taking over, and all of a sudden we fought this war and we got another dictator basically in charge of the country. So there was a real resistance, you see, to creating a strong central government, and they tried to make this work, but it didn't work. And one of the problems was without a strong central government that had the ability to tax the population directly and to create an army and a navy and so forth. Without a strong central government, you could not create a strong monetary system. And a monetary system was essential. Without a strong monetary system, you couldn't trade effectively with other countries. And so the economy just wasn't working, right? So finally, enough people started realizing we got to do something different. We've got to change this. Now, this fear about a king actually was more than just a fantasy. No less than, this is something else, another little tidbit of history I picked up in preparing for this talk. No less than Alexander Hamilton, who's now been made famous by Lin-Manuel Miranda in Hamilton on Broadway. Great show. Marty and I had the chance of seeing. We've actually seen it. It's worth seeing, believe me. But no less than Alexander Hamilton, he and a group of politicians wrote a letter to the Prince Henry of Prussia and asked this Prince Henry, would you like to be our new king? You see? So there was because Alexander Hamilton really believed that we needed to have a strong central government. He didn't really think the people could run the government. He thought that he looked at the mobs out there and he said, most people were uneducated. They didn't have a school educational system then. He says, this is not practical. You see, he wasn't the only one that thought like this. He felt that we need a government that's going to be run by the educated, by the aristocracy. And we need to have a strong leader. We'll call him a president, but he'll basically be a king. So that was what he really believed at one point. Now, he evolved, right, and he changed as time went on. Now, this is what saved the day. This is where another great leader of our country came in, James Madison. James Madison is called the father of the Constitution. James Madison steps forward when they met in it was 1787. James Madison steps in and they said, we've got to do something here. We've got to create a federal government. How is this going to work? And James Madison said, this is the way to do it. And he had actually written a draft constitution. Now he had been on the committee in Virginia that had drafted the Virginia Constitution. And so he basically had the Virginia Constitution, and it worked. He said, let's try it on a federal level. Now, the beauty of this Constitution that he presented was that he provided for a division of power, okay? It created a form of government in which one person or one group of people, it was impossible for them to come and take over the government, okay? And everybody looked at this and said, this is interesting, you know. It created for 3 branches of government, the executive branch, which is the president, of course, and then the Congress, and the Congress itself was broken up into the House of Representatives and the Senate. They had to agree. And then you had the judiciary, who was going to make sure that everybody, all the boys, obeyed the rules of the Constitution. That was the judiciary's responsibility. So it was a really interesting system of checks and balances, and everybody bought into it. But it starts off with the words, we the people. It's all based on a democratic model where it's a group effort, you see, to make it work. And this is totally different. See, in Europe, none of the countries are run like this. They all had kings and queens, and because they couldn't imagine everybody coming together and agreeing. Now, the one absolutely essential ingredient that made this work it's all summed up in one word. It's called compromise. They had to be willing to give and take. A democracy cannot work unless we're willing to give and take. Both sides, all sides, right? And they were able to do it. That was part of the genius of all these people, because even with this Constitution, it still required huge compromise on everyone's part. And but they did it, you see. And we need to remember that when we're with our current Congress, you see, we're all having a problem with compromise right now. The Founding Fathers showed us how to do it, you see. We need to look at their example and say, okay, they showed us how to do it, we need to do it too, darn it, you know. We need to work on this as well. So this Constitution was adopted in 88, and it was an amazing document. Let me see here. It's 4,000. Let me get my figures here right. 4,440 words long. It's the oldest and the shortest written constitution of any major government in the world. George Washington was so happy when finally this Constitution was created, which he knew he felt strongly was going to work. It did provide for a very strong federal government, and also it defined the powers of the state and local governments. That George Washington, he said that the Constitution appears to me then a little short of a miracle. And it was a miracle that everyone agreed, everyone was able to compromise and come together at the table. He was so thankful that he issued, when he became president, a proclamation in which he created the very first day of Thanksgiving on November 26, 1789, as a national holiday. So when we all sit around our tables and eating our turkey dinners this Thanksgiving, we need to remind ourselves that the reason we're having Thanksgiving is that the original reason was we wanted to give thanks for the creation of our Constitution. Isn't that interesting? John Adams referred to the Constitution as the greatest single effort of national deliberation that the world has ever seen. Okay, and by that he meant it was the first time a whole group of people had come together, and together we're all creating our government. You see, and it was really amazing. James Madison wrote, "The happy union of the states is a wonder, the Constitution a miracle, and their example the hope of liberty throughout the world." Sometimes these things I get touched by these things. And their example, the hope of liberty throughout the world. Now, the Constitution is approved. Everyone's saying, finally, we've got a government. Let's see if this will work. They didn't know if it would work. They said, let's see if this will work. But there was a major problem. And many people pointed this out. The Constitution showed how the government was to work, but it didn't spell out the rights of the people, right? And so they began working on that. And they came up with what's known as the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. We call it the Bill of Rights. And in 1792, the Bill of Rights was approved. And the Bill of Rights is extremely important. It basically outlines what are the rights of the people. The First Amendment is the amendment that I really want us to take a look at today. That is the First Amendment states that we have the right to worship God as we choose, and that the government will not interfere with the way we choose to pray. Okay, the government will not create a religion of its own. That's all stated in the First Amendment. The First Amendment also says that we have the freedom of speech and freedom of the press. It also says we have the right to assemble as people and have peacefully assemble and to protest to the government complaints that we might have about the government. Okay, those are all three rights in the First Amendment to the Constitution. Now, to me, it's really interesting that the very first right of these 10 amendments, right, the very first right gives us the right for freedom of religion. Isn't that interesting, right? This shows you how important our founding fathers found the idea of freedom of religion to be. And my thoughts is that at the end of the day, when we finish up our lives and we're at the end of our life, we look back and we say, what's this life been all about, Well, the bottom line is that it's all about getting ourselves right with God, as I understand it, That's really what it's all about, you see. Now, having the freedom, you see, to pursue God, to search for God as we choose, nothing could be more important than this. And that's why this First Amendment was so important. Now, this First Amendment came from was created as a result of several things that happened. Number one, when Thomas Jefferson in 1777 drafted a statute called the Statute of Freedom in Virginia for religious freedom. Okay, Statute of Religious Freedom in Virginia, I think was the title. Okay, and he drafted that in 1777. That was like basically the model that was used they created this First Amendment. Thomas Jefferson, along with other people in his time, he was of course a member of a great high priest of the Enlightenment. They looked at the history of Europe and they saw the terrible things that had been going on in Europe. In Europe, there had always been this wedding between church and state, and there's some benefits to that. That if I'm married, if I have an alliance with the government, that means my church we can do what we want. You see, and the government says, well, if we have the religion on our side, which all the people are very involved with the religion, then they'll support the government. There was some positive side to this, but there was a very dark side. The dark side was that when egoic minds, you see, who were running the church took over, terrible things happened. We had the Inquisition, for example. We had a series of wars that went on for over 100 years because of the Reformation, when large numbers and entire nations broke away from the Catholic Church. There were these terrible wars between the Catholics and the Protestants. In one of these wars, just to give you an idea of this, there was the 30 Years' War. According to Wikipedia, a good source of information these days, 8 million people were slaughtered in this war. Can you imagine anything more insane? You've got these two armies. They all got the banners of the Christian cross. They all got their cadre of priests out there praying that our God will be on our side. They go into battle and they slaughter each other in the name of Jesus. Can you imagine anything more insane than this? You see? Total insanity. And so Thomas Jefferson's aware of this history, and so is everyone else, these other folks, and they say, we got to stop this, you see. And that's why he's the first one to really step forward and actually draft a piece of legislation. That was in 1777, only a year after he had done the Declaration of Independence. It was 11 years later in 1787 when it took that long for the state legislature of Virginia to actually pass that legislation. But when it was passed, it provided a model for this national conventions as the way they could run the way we could create this Constitution. So we owe a lot to Thomas Jefferson's leadership on this. It's interesting. I don't know how many of you have ever been to Monticello, but when Marty and I visited Monticello, we went to Jefferson's tombstone, and the inscription, it reads this. He's buried there. Here was buried Thomas Jefferson, author of the Declaration of American Independence, of the Statue of Virginia for Religious Freedom, and the father of the University of Virginia. Amazingly, he doesn't make any mention of the 8 years he was president of the United States. Isn't that interesting? He doesn't. That shows you how much importance he put upon this Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom. He really realized how important freedom of religion is. Now that takes us to this bird. And yeah. That letter, by the way, that he wrote, that Ben Franklin wrote to his daughter, was a private letter. He never publicly told everybody what he thought. But of course, his daughter released the letter later, right? But he was, and it's interesting. He was actually, Ben Franklin was on the first committee. What happened with our national seal was there were 3 committees that met over a 6-year period to create a national seal. Right the same day that the Declaration of Independence was ratified, July 4, 1776, the Congress appointed a committee to create a national seal, which is the equivalent, is basically a coat of arms. All the other countries have coat of arms. And so Ben Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams were on that committee. And they came up with ideas, but the only idea that was really that was really kept when they actually created the national seal was the E pluribus unum. I believe it was Thomas Jefferson wanted to use those Latin words. But there were 3 committees created, and in 1782, the Congress got the guy named, his name was Charles Thompson, who was the secretary for the Congress. They said, there were 3 committees that met over a 6-year period. They said, take the best of these committees, put there all the suggestions that you think make sense, and come up with a great seal for us. And so this fellow named Charles Thompson, who nobody's ever heard of, really is the one that put it all together. And so this interesting symbology here in this great seal. First of all, we have the eagle, right? And this is a bald-headed eagle. It's not the eagle, the Roman eagle, for example, or the Prussian eagle. He chose the bald-headed eagle. The eagle, there's an old tale that says that when there's a storm, birds normally will either fight against the storm so they're not blown out of the air, or they'll take refuge. But the old tale says that eagles are different. Eagles will soar above the storm, okay? And there's great spiritual meaning to this. What is prayer? What do we do with prayer? With prayer, we seek to transcend the problems that we're dealing with, okay? We seek to rise above. We seek to see God as being where the problem appears to be. That's what prayer is. So that's the first bit of symbology here with this eagle, is that the eagle represents prayer, the power of prayer. It's a bald-headed eagle. Now, the bald-headed eagle, this is a metaphysical interpretation. The bald-headed eagle represents the 7th chakra, okay? The 7th chakra is sometimes called the crown chakra, the lotus chakra. It's the chakra that connects directly with God. It's when we have direct communion with God. So we have an eagle here that it's a bald-headed eagle. It's interesting, in Christian monasticism, the monks will very often have their head shaved as part of their ordination. And now the monks didn't understand about the chakra systems, right? It was not part of Christian theology, but the monks did understand about prayer. And they knew that when they were in communion with God, they could feel it up here, you see? So this idea of a bald-headed eagle has some very interesting symbology to it. Now, we have the right talon, they call it, the right claws here. We have the olive branch, right? We have 13 leaves, 13 berries in the olive branch. Over here, the left talon, we have 13 arrows. The message here is that we choose peace. The right hand is the dominant hand. We want peace, but we will only do war as a last resort when peace fails. The eagle's head is facing the right hand. You see another message that this is a symbology here, that we want peace. Always peace first. War should only be a absolute last resort. These words, e pluribus unum, it means one out of many. Now, this is a great spiritual teaching, right? All the spiritual teachings can be reduced to this basic teaching that we're all one. We have God. God expresses Himself, herself, itself in many ways. But we're all one, you see. So it's a great, powerful spiritual teaching here. This is, of course, when they wrote this, they were thinking about the 13 states are one. But basically, the truth is, we're all one. Then I'm coming to an end here with this. I appreciate everybody's patience. I kind of got fascinated with this. I got carried away in studying all this. But anyway, so the e pluribus unum. We all know that just about every coin has got e pluribus unum. So here just about all Americans are running around, you see, with this great spiritual teaching right in our pockets that we're not aware of. That's the beauty of symbology and spiritual symbology. We all basically have it right in our pockets. The great truth of life. The number 13 appears over and over again in this great seal. The number 13 has spiritual implications. I asked Sharon Solomon here, what did Paul have to say about the number 13? And she explained to me that Paul Solomon said that from a metaphysical interpretation of that number is that we look at the horoscope, we've got the 12 houses of the horoscope. They're all in horizontal like this. And he said that each of the houses represents a lesson that we are to learn, okay? So we have many incarnations to do this. And we learn these lessons. And then, finally, when we've learned the lessons, we go to the center, which is the 13th step. This is vertical, right? So 13 represents enlightenment. It represents total liberation. So that's what. So we have the number 13 over and over again. You know, the 13 states, of course, and so forth. 13 eras. Now, some of the most important, some of the most beautiful symbology is on the backside of the Great Seal. The backside never was that popular. You see, it's interesting. It's like it was hard to even find it. They didn't even cut the seal for it, with the mint. But there was great symbology in this great, and most interesting symbology really is in this the backside of the Great Seal. You have a pyramid that's unfinished. No surprise, 13 steps, right? 13 steps up, and at the top you have this symbol of the single eye. Now, when Charles Thompson presented all this to the Congress in 1782, he had to explain to them what the symbology was for them to buy into it, right? And all he said very little. Sometimes saying very little is the best way to do it, because the less you say, the less controversial. He says the pyramid signals strength and duration. This is the official interpretation. The eye over it and the motto allude to the many signal interpositions of providence in favor of the American cause. In other words, he's saying that basically the single eye represents God, the eye of God, helping us as we are creating our country. And everybody says, okay, we buy that, and so this is how it got in here. But there's a great spiritual symbology here. The single eye, Jesus talks about it when he says, "Let if thy eye be single, thy body shall be filled with light." He says the eye is the light of the body. And what did Jesus mean by that? Well, the single eye is the eye in which you and I are focused only upon the presence of God. We're not looking at everything else, which is what our egos do. Our ego is analyzing everything. It has multiple eyes. The single eye is when we refocus everything, which we do in prayer and meditation, and we focus upon our connectedness, our oneness with God. So this pyramid is saying our country is complete, right? It's doing what it's supposed to do. It's carrying out its work in this world to its highest potential when we are connected with God. It's basically what this symbology here is telling us. Isn't that interesting? But when we lose that connectedness, that single eye, that single focus, we lose everything. You know, in Hinduism, they have the dot here, the red dot. Same thing. It's the sixth chakra. It's the chakra that we associate with the pituitary gland. They're talking about the same idea of the single eye, of being focused only upon the presence of God. And then, of course, we have these Latin words here. Novus Ordo Seclorum, a new order of the ages, and annuit coptis means God has favored our undertakings. These are both from Virgil, which is interesting, and quotes from Virgil. But basically, it's just saying that God is we're doing all this in accordance with the will of God and with the flow of God. So I'm going to quit with this right here. Just in closing, I do want to just reiterate that if we consider, which we have just done, what this country is all about, how it was created, we consider the great work of our forefathers. We need to apply that today to what we're doing. Today, our country is really having a big challenge. Emmett Fox, who's one of my great spiritual teachers, says that he wrote a lot about the interpretation of all this as well that I used in my talk today. But Emmett Fox says that the only time our country is ever really threatened is when we fight amongst ourselves. This happened in the American Civil War when we almost destroyed ourselves, right? When 11 states, southern states, decided we're no longer going to comply with the Constitution. So it's critical, see, that we get through this period that we're going through, and I'm talking about all of us, not just the Republicans and not just the Democrats, but all of us. We need to pull through this thing of this polarity and recognize, just like the Founding Fathers, that yes, I really want this, but I really want my country to work even more. And we've got to compromise. And so we use the inspiration and the leadership of our Founding Fathers. If we follow them, we can bring our country back together again. Let's put our egos aside, you see, and let's open our single eye. Thank you very much.